I was sitting in the passenger seat of the van going through my notes when I first heard the song. Nick was standing in the back setting up equipment, and I realized he had just turned on the parabolic microphone we used to record conversations over a distance. I wasn't paying much attention, but I could hear the woman talking. He's so cool. I wasn't sure I heard it right, but it sounded like I did. I wasn't sure what kind of conversation it was because usually Nick would just point the mic in a general direction, setting it up for the conversation we wanted to capture. What the hell are you listening to back there, Nick? I asked, looking over my shoulder into the back of the van. Nick was working on the long lens camera we were using for videotaping and wasn't paying much attention to the sound. What do you mean, Bobby? He asked, breaking away from his occupation. Weren't you listening to that woman? I asked, grinning as I heard the conversation continuing in the background. Not really. There's a couple of women sitting at a table in a cafe on the other side of the square, but I wasn't listening to what they were talking about. He looked out the open door of the van in the direction the microphone was pointed. I swear, when he stuck it in me, I felt it push my tonsils out. I heard a woman's voice as she continued. I had to listen more closely since Nick had just turned on the microphone. I could hear a lot of static and extraneous noise that made it hard for me to make out the words. I knew that before we were ready, he would clean up the signal and adjust the gain so that the conversation we expected to hear would be crystal clear. I work as an investigative reporter for the Washington Defender newspaper, and Nick was my tech guy. He and I have been partners for the past 4 years and have worked well together. At this point, I was awaiting an interview with Senator Nathan Smith. My editor had received an anonymous tip that the senator was meeting his mistress at a hotel, and I was here to talk to him about it. No, I didn't work for one of those rundown gossip sites, but for a newspaper that was known for its honesty, integrity, and objectivity. So, you may ask, why was I here to find out about a senator who may be cheating on his wife? Actually, the illicit affair was of no consequence to me. However, the senator was a member of the Foreign Relations Committee as well as the Senate Appropriations Committee. Both of these positions were very prestigious, and if someone decided to use information about the illicit affair to blackmail him, it could be a real problem. His position in the Senate was not only important in terms of how he could vote or how he could influence his colleagues, but if he was forced to resign, it could also change the balance of power in the Senate. If he loses his seat, there is always the possibility that another party will take it over and thus become one seat closer to regaining the majority they recently lost. If that happens, the future of the country is once again in jeopardy. Another issue that concerned me and my editor was that in Las Vegas, the senator was betting that he would be selected as the vice presidential candidate in next year's presidential election. With that kind of pressure on him, the last thing he and the rest of the country needed was a threat that he would somehow leave his wife. I had known the senator for about 15 years. I wouldn't say we were good friends, but we were more than casual acquaintances. When we first met, he was a newly elected congressman from Nebraska, and I was a young 20-something college student interning at a newspaper. I say at the newspaper, even though the print version made up a very small percentage of our readership. In fact, if it weren't for that small but loyal group of subscribers who demanded it, we would have stopped publishing the print version a few years earlier. The paper had a very loyal base, although not as large as some other publications in Washington. Readers were very loyal because they knew they could get the truth from us without the unnecessary idle chatter that many other news media insistently added to their propaganda. I say propaganda because many of them seem to be in business not to simply report the news, but to present it in a way that incorporated their own political agenda. The driving forces in Washington understood that if something appeared in our publication, it was factual and accurate information. In fact, we didn't print anything without confirmation from one or more absolutely reliable sources. This philosophy has been a hallmark of the newspaper from its founding in the mid-60s to the present day. Our publication was almost mandatory reading for every politician, lawyer, and lobbyist in town. Some of them may not have liked what we published, but every one of them respected what we did. I can't believe you did something like that, sis. The woman's voice invaded my thoughts again. I really didn't want to listen to their conversation, but for some reason I couldn't stop. I know the extraneous noise and interference made it require more concentration than it should have, but for some reason I couldn't ignore it. I can't believe it either, but it just happened. We were in the house. He was showing us around, and Will went out to the garage to check it out. Gerald and I were in the kitchen, just making small talk. Well, we wanted to have a little fun. But then we heard Will coming back. We pulled away from each other, I heard her say. She mentioned the name Will, and I have a brother-in-law named Will. As Nick started fiddling with the microphone to adjust the clarity of the sound, I suddenly realized I was listening to my sister-in-law Laura, and she was talking to my wife Lynn. So how did it come about that you did get on with this? I heard my wife ask, and she giggled as she asked the question. He took one of his business cards, wrote a phone number on the back, and handed it to me, telling me to call him, which I did. Later in the afternoon, we went back to that house and we got down to it. I heard Laura answer my wife. It wasn't? Yes. It was great, said Laura, and I could almost see the smirk on her face as she spoke to Lynn. You're crazy. What are you going to do if Will finds out? Asked Lynn. Will won't find out, and even if he does find out, he loves me enough to forgive me. You're awfully sure of yourself. How many times have you heard the story of a wife cheating on her husband, and he finds out, and the next thing you know, they're already divorced? My wife offered to her sister. I was glad that Lynn was starting to think more logically, although I thought that perhaps she should have been more forceful in pointing out to her sister that she had done something wrong. I was surprised at some points in the conversation. Are you listening to this shit? Said Nick, his words interrupting my thoughts about my wife. Yeah, I'm trying to go through my notes, but I can't believe the crap they're talking about. I said, not wanting Nick to know about my relationship with the two women. You think women talk about that all the time when they're alone? He said, grinning as he spun the dials and brought the conversation into a clearer focus. I have no idea, but I don't think it's much different than how guys talk about women, suggested I, and he agreed wholeheartedly. When do you think the senator will show up? He asked, changing the topic of conversation. I don't know exactly, but I gave the porter a nice new picture of Ben Franklin to send me a message when he sees the senator heading for the door. We should have a little advance warning, but I can't tell you when that might be. I know there's a meeting this morning, and I don't think he's going to miss it, so it probably won't be soon. I replied, going back to thinking about my reason for being here. I was relieved about the conversation I was eavesdropping on when my phone rang, and I looked at the message. The senator was on his way down, and it was time for me to head for the hotel doors. The plan was to pretend like I'd met him by chance, and then we'd have time to talk, I hoped. I didn't know exactly his schedule, but I knew it was almost an hour before the first Senate meeting of the day. I paced briskly across the square, and just as he was walking out the door, I was close enough to speak to him without raising my voice. Hey, Nate. Nice to meet you here, I said with a smile, extending my hand for a handshake. Good morning, Bobby. Yeah, it's a coincidence, isn't it? He said with a sly grin on his face. Okay, so it's not a coincidence. Sue me, said I, when we got close enough to lower my voice and speak normally. He wasn't stupid and realized that the odds of this being a coincidental encounter were very slim. Well, since we both know this isn't just a chance encounter, what's on your mind? He said, never being one to beat around the bush. I liked that about him. I didn't always agree with everything he did, but he was an honest and ethical man. The fact that he was a politician didn't contribute much to my appreciation of his character, but I had known him long enough to realize that he was one of the most ethical and honest people I had ever met. How about I buy you a cup of coffee? I began, pointing toward the coffee shop next to the hotel. Are you trying to bribe me, Bobby? He said with a wide grin on his face. If you can be bought for a cup of coffee, I think this country is in big trouble. I can't, but I can think of a couple of my coworkers who might. He said it softly, and several names came to mind at that remark. I didn't bother to continue. We walked over and sat down at the same table that, coincidentally, my wife and her sister had recently occupied. The waiter had just finished cleaning up after them and wiping down the table when we took our seats. I'll send a waitress right away, gentlemen, he said, and disappeared inside. Soon, a pleasant young woman came out, and we ordered a cup of black coffee each before we started talking. When she brought the coffee and set it on the table, and we declined any other offers, we got down to business. So, we know this isn't just a chance meeting, and I'm assuming you're working on a story, he began. As I said, the senator was shallow and knew how things worked in Washington. I first met him 15 years ago when he was a newly elected congressman from Nebraska, and I was a 20-year-old intern just starting out at a newspaper. I was hired as a reporter after I graduated from college, and at the same time, he was re-elected to a second term in Congress. He was just about to run for a third term when one of the senators from Nebraska had a heart attack and died in office. The governor appointed Nate to fill the remainder of the senator's term, and then he ran for and was elected to a full term. He was now halfway through his second full term and had risen in power and prestige among his colleagues in the Senate. He was highly respected, and I was fortunate enough to be able to consider him a casual friend. No, this is not just a chance meeting. I need to discuss a couple things with you. If you have a few minutes, I would appreciate your time, I began. And I assume you're writing this down? He asked, though he didn't really need to do that. He and I both knew that if he asked me not to record or repeat it, it wouldn't be recorded and would never be repeated. You're right, Nate. You're being captured on camera and on audio. Are you okay with that? I asked, knowing that if he said no, Nick would immediately shut down the equipment. No, it's fine. I have nothing to hide, he said confidently. Well, I know you and I are going to dance around this issue, so I'll just start with the reason I'm here to talk to you. Fire, he said, taking a sip of coffee, and then leaned back in his chair and waited for me to begin. My editor has received an anonymous tip that you're having an extramarital affair. Personally, of course I don't care, but unfortunately, there are those who might. You know our policy. We don't print dirty gossip, and I'm not here to look for a story to deceive the National Enquirer. Like I said, I personally don't care if you have an affair or not, but you know there are consequences, right? He only nodded and took another sip of coffee. Something like this could expose you to potential blackmail, and I'm sure you realize what consequences that could lead to. You also know that you will never be seen or heard from in this town by a lot of people who have far less scruples than I do. I'm sure neither you nor your wife want to be involved in some smutty media hype. You know that won't happen with the defender, but you also know that there are plenty of other people around with very low ethical standards. I didn't tell him anything he didn't know, but I thought just reminding him of it would be helpful. I'm not having an affair with Bobby, and I never would. I know that you and your newspaper aren't the type to spread rumors like that, and I know that simply denying it won't give me the credibility you're looking for, but I'm telling you the truth, he said, looking me straight in the eye. I've been doing this long enough to be able to read people almost like a book. There was not a hint of dishonesty on his face, and I was sure he was telling me the truth. Nevertheless, someone apparently thought he was having an affair, and that someone had taken the time and trouble to contact my editor. I wondered if they approached us knowing that we would find out the truth, or if we were just the first of several other media organizations this person might have approached to somehow embarrass the senator. It has come to my attention that you are on the presidential ticket for next year, I said, changing the subject slightly. It was more of a statement than a question, though I suppose he could have taken it both ways. Huh? I hadn't heard that. Do you know something I don't? He spoke, keeping a neutral expression on his face. He was a skilled politician, and I wondered if he had learned to lie as well as I had learned to read people's thoughts and emotions. I didn't have to worry about complete honesty, but I sensed that at the moment he didn't know. Of course, the election was almost 18 months away, and I didn't think choosing a vice presidential candidate would happen this far into the election. Well, if no one has asked you yet, I hope to be the first person you tell about it when it happens, I said, always looking for an angle and a different story. Well, you'll be in line somewhere after my wife if I ever have to answer that question. He didn't say it outright, but I realized he was repeating his earlier statement about not having an affair. We each knew I understood the meaning of what he said, and I had to respect him for the way he said it. Okay, after your wife then, but I really hope I come second. I smiled, finishing the last sip of coffee. Anything else I can help you with today, Bobby? He said, and I realized our conversation was almost over. No, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Have a good day and hopefully we can talk again soon, I said as we stood up and shook hands before we parted ways. So, Bobby, do you think he was telling the truth? Asked Nick as I walked back to the van. I didn't see any indication that he wasn't telling the truth. He's a politician after all, and some of them can talk a lot without saying anything. However, he denied it outright, so I have to think he wasn't trying to split hairs or play with semantics. I thought for a bit. Yeah, I thought he was honest too. And in this town, an honest politician is pretty hard to find. He laughed heartily. Yeah, I know you're right. By the way, do you still have the tape of the conversation between those women before I met with the senator? I said it nonchalantly, not wanting Nick to think I was too interested in what they were saying. Yeah, I've got everything here. What's up? Can you drop me a copy? I just couldn't believe what they were saying and thought I'd like to watch it again, just for a laugh. I said this, hoping he wouldn't find my request unusual. No problem, boss. The DVD will be on your desk after lunch, he said, gathering his equipment. Next chapter. Back home, I didn't say anything to my wife about seeing her or overhearing their conversation. I didn't want her to think I was following her or eavesdropping on what she might be talking about. Nevertheless, the conversation did strike me as somewhat odd. I also thought my wife's sister was a cheating whore. I always thought there was something about her, but I had no way of knowing what it was. She was nice enough to me, but there was always something about her that kept me on my toes. Lynn and I socialized regularly with her sister and her sister's husband, Will. They were nice people, and other than a tickle in the back of my mind about her sister, I couldn't find anything I didn't like about them. Sometimes we played golf with Will, sometimes we went to a ball game together or drank beer after work, but we didn't usually revolve in the same social circles. I wondered if I should let him know what Laura had done, but then I thought about how it might affect him and their marriage. I knew they were looking for a house, and Lynn had told me that although they didn't have any definite plans yet, they were starting to think about children. I wondered if I said anything to Will, how it would change their plans and whether or not it would be fair to him. Laura had said that he loved her enough to forgive her, and maybe that was the case. I decided it wasn't worth saying anything since I didn't know the whole situation. When I got home, Lynn looked normal, and it was business as usual. She didn't have a full-time job, but she volunteered periodically at several non-profit organizations in the area. We had been married for almost 10 years, and for the first 5 years she worked. But after a while she decided that I was making enough money and that she would rather do volunteer work than work 9 to 5 and toil in an office where she felt the internal politics were a distraction from what could be an enjoyable experience for all the employees. I listened to some of her complaints at the time, but it had been long enough since she had worked in that environment that I didn't think what was going on at the time could affect her now. For the next few days, life went on as normal, but then everything changed. On Tuesday, I came home from work as usual, and as usual, Lynn was in the kitchen making dinner. The first thing I noticed was that she was wearing a nice blouse and a short skirt. I knew she went to one of the non-profit offices where she volunteered and might have worn that, but she usually changed her clothes by the time she got home, not wanting to ruin her nice clothes if she spilled something in the kitchen while making dinner. She hummed and used perfume, which was another difference from her usual lifestyle. When I went over to kiss her on the cheek as I usually did when I got home, she turned to face me and our lips met. She kissed me hard, but when I looked at her face to gauge her reaction, she wasn't looking me in the eye. She took a few steps back, and as we talked, I saw that although she was trying to look at me, she wasn't actually looking at my eyes or face but over my shoulder. I had known her long enough to know that she felt guilty about something, and the conversation from a few days earlier had clued me into exactly what her guilt was. I knew she did, even though at the time she was trying to explain to her sister how wrong she was for doing what she did. Apparently, she either thought about it enough to change her mind, or her sister kept working on her and convinced her that the reward would be worth any possible consequences. I wasn't sure what those consequences might be, But it hurt that she hadn't found enough here at home with me, that she needed to go out and experience something with another guy. Thinking about it, I realized that our lives had become more complacent and comfortable than when we first met. I glanced over at the stove and saw that she was cooking some of my favorite dishes, and I wondered if that was part of her guilt. I had taken enough psychology courses in college, and 15 years as a reporter had taught me enough about body language and what to look for to know exactly what was going on in a person's head. I realized that she was trying to get rid of her remorse, and the fact that she was feeling guilty made me realize that she still had feelings for me. I tried not to let it bother me, but it still did. I went into the living room and sat down to watch the evening news while Lynn finished dinner, and then sat down with her when she called me to the table. We made small talk as usual. I wasn't going to get confrontational with her, and she didn't seem eager to confess, so things fell into a routine, although I felt some tension as we ate. I knew I'd always loved Lynn, but now, as I reflected on my life with her, I began to think about other things. Sure, she had broken our wedding vows, and that bothered me, but not as much as I would have thought before something like that happened. I kept remembering the one that said she would leave everyone else behind, and I know she didn't. But as I went through the other vows in my mind, I got to the last one and thought about it. You know, the one that says, as long as we're both alive. We've been together for almost 12 years now, including 2 years before we got married, and almost 10 years after. I didn't think about it at the time, because we were young. But now the thought of us spending another 40 or 50 years together seems a lot longer than I used to think. In fact, I hadn't even considered it until now. Sure, we had a comfortable life, and maybe even too comfortable. Thinking back on it, I wondered if I had started to take her for granted, and maybe that was why she felt the need to leave. Maybe we had each become too content with our lives, and she was the first of the two of us to decide she needed a change. I immediately dismissed the thought, because I personally have never had the desire to give in to any temptation I have ever encountered. I had met many women in my line of work. Some of them were my colleagues at the newspaper, and others I socialized with in the line of duty. I was given many opportunities, but I never once seriously considered taking advantage of any opportunity I was ever given by a woman. I was proud of this, but now I had to reflect on the fact that perhaps my personal ethics were flawed. As I tried to analyze all of my feelings, I realized that I wasn't really as angry as I probably should have been. In some ways, I was more angry at myself than at my wife. I never thought she might cheat, nor had I given it much thought. But in a more general sense, I had always thought that men whose wives cheated on them were partly to blame themselves. I always wondered how someone could say they felt something strange was going on, but not take any steps to stop it before it happened. It was as if they allowed the woman to form an intention without any consequences, but only reacted after the action was taken. I always thought I should be more proactive. If I had just thought my marriage might be in danger, I would have done something to prevent the threat long before it turned into action. Obviously, I fell into the same trap as other men I thought were powerless. I assumed that what Lynn had told her sister a few days earlier in their conversation was true, and didn't look into it further, and perhaps if I had, things might have been different. Next chapter. The next morning I showered and dressed, then went downstairs to find Lynn making breakfast. She seemed to be in a good mood. We ate together sometimes, but we usually went in different directions, and we didn't always have time. I wondered if she was still trying to make amends, but I couldn't judge that from her actions today. I wondered for a moment if she seemed to be making amends to me for any injustice she might have felt about her action, or perhaps she had concluded that since I didn't know, there would be no consequences for her actions. I didn't know what I had decided, but although I was disappointed, I wasn't going to confront her or do anything to change our relationship. I had a few things to do today, and while I tried to minimize Lynn's act, they needed to be done. Nick gave me a copy of the conversation we'd overheard a few days ago, and I popped the DVD into my computer and plugged in my headphones to listen to it in private. I wasn't really surprised by what I heard, although I listened more carefully to get more information. I was sure I had memorized everything, but I just needed to make sure. After listening to the conversation again, I put the disc back in the envelope Nick had given me and closed it in my desk drawer. I had business to run, but I didn't think I'd be gone long. I didn't have my own secretary, but we had a woman who looked after the office, and I informed her that I would be out of the office for probably an hour, but that I would be back soon. After that, I walked across the street to the subway station and took a short ride to the clinic. The thought that Lynn might have brought home some kind of venereal disease from Mr. Bastard gnawed at me, at least figuratively, and I really hoped not literally. I took the tests and was assured that the results would be ready in 2 or 3 days. I don't know why, but I was sure everything was fine. But then again, you never know. I also realized that until I knew, I would have to stay away from my wife. "Hey, Will, how are you doing?" I started the conversation when my brother-in-law answered the phone. "About as good as you'd expect? Nothing changes," he said, though his voice didn't sound as steady as it might have sounded. "Anything new on the housing front?" I figured I could get to the reason for my call, though he didn't know it. He and Laura had been looking at houses, and Lynn told me they were thinking of finding one and then starting their own family. They'd been living in an apartment for the last 4 years, and they'd each decided it was time to get something bigger and start accumulating equity. Nothing so far. We look at the house and sometimes it has a few good features, but mostly there's more negatives than positives. He began in response to my question. "Huh? I thought Lynn said the last house you looked at made an impression on you." I said my wife hadn't said anything of the sort, but I figured I'd lead him down the path I expected him to take. "Really? It had a few pluses, but like I said, there were also a lot of minuses. The garage is small, the yard too. I'd have to drive at least 8 more miles, and the taxes. My God, you can't believe how expensive taxes are," he said in despair. "Welcome to Washington, D.C." I laughed. Life here was a shock to those who had never experienced it before. "I guess we just have to keep looking. I know we'll find something sooner or later, but I just wish these agents would get it into their heads to show me what I want to see. I tell them what I'm looking for, state my price range, and the first thing they do is show me houses that are $50,000 over my upper limit. Then they try to twist my arms and tell me that this house has almost everything I want and that if I don't buy it, someone else will." Will lamented all the downsides of looking for a house. I know he'd never done it before, but a lot of it was pretty typical, regardless of where the person was looking. Lynn and I had done it twice before, our house being the second one we lived in here in the metro area. "Yeah, I guess realtors rank right up there with used car salesmen," said I with a chuckle, and he totally agreed. We continued talking for a few more minutes, and I ended the conversation by reminding him about the barbecue he and Laura were going to have the following weekend. During the conversation, I also learned the name of the real estate company he was using, which was just what I wanted. After I finished talking to Will, I went downstairs and found Gloria. Gloria was an old friend of mine who had worked at the paper as long as I had and worked in the research department. I knew she would help me without question, so I asked her to find some background information on Gerald. She didn't bother to ask why I needed the information and replied that she would have something for me later that day. I knew she would. Gloria was good at her job, so I left the research in her capable hands and returned to my office. I spent the rest of the morning doing the mundane things a reporter has to do. Meeting with my editor about the interview with the senator, making a few phone calls and trying to find leads for the other stories we were working on. Just after 2 hours, I got a memo from Gloria. It was a small folder of information. There wasn't much in it, but then again, I realized that for some local guy who sells real estate, it might not be much. I was used to getting thick folders whenever I did a biography of a public figure, but it was different here. The first page was mostly demographic information, which I didn't take a long time to scan. The guy was 41 years old and had been in real estate sales since he graduated high school. He was making good money but hadn't gotten rich, although I wondered how many realtors actually got rich selling houses. I figured that if he worked somewhere other than Washington, D.C., he'd be mediocre at best, but with the cost of housing here and the need for constant turnover, he probably managed to sell enough houses to live comfortably. He was married, but I saw that he was divorced and had a 19-year-old daughter. There was other minor information, like a couple speeding tickets, and the fact that his credit rating, while decent, was nowhere near stellar. I guess I couldn't really say anything about that. Most people don't have a credit rating like Donald Trump or Bill Gates. The next page interested me more. It contained personal information that you couldn't get just by doing a quick Google search. I knew that Gloria and her staff had made several phone calls and talked to various people who knew this guy, and this was relevant information straight from first-hand experience. I learned that he had been a player, cheating on his wife for almost as long as they had been married. Apparently, she had caught him doing it several times, and each time he promised it would be the last, but never did. 3 years ago, something pissed her off to the point where she filed for divorce from him. I completely understand why she did that, but that's when her life started falling apart. She filed a lawsuit citing infidelity as the reason, but unfortunately, she had no proof of the infidelity. Everyone knew the guy was running around and couldn't hold his own, but without any real proof, she had no chance in court. He hired a lawyer who turned out to be a real pit bull, a real bastard in every sense of the word. He used every dirty trick in the book to thwart her attempts to get a divorce. I'm sure she only wanted to leave him, but at the same time she wanted to leave with some assets and dignity intact. Obviously, he didn't want that. His attorney started hinting at mental instability, incompetence, and even started throwing around terms like involuntary guardianship. His wife had been pushed beyond her ability to tolerate, and she had really crossed the line. She had some sort of mental disorder, and his attorney used that as a basis to dismiss her claims. To my surprise, he was awarded custody of his 16-year-old daughter. I thought this was odd, because usually in these cases the woman gets custody, but it was his wife's actions that were her undoing. Because of everything he put her through, she threatened to kill him and did so in front of witnesses. His lawyer picked up on this threat and issued a restraining order forbidding her from going near her husband or daughter. This only plunged her into more depression, and the court said there was nothing they could do but remove the girl from her mother's influence. I had all the information I intended to get, and I probably should have stopped, but I couldn't. I had already decided that I would put this behind me and try not to worry about it, but I decided that I wanted to find out what this guy had that I didn't. I don't know why I wanted to see him up close, after all. I had read all the information Gloria had gathered. There wasn't much else I could have figured out on my own, but I decided I needed to anyway. I wondered if I should park outside his office just to take a look at him, but then another thought occurred to me. He was a real estate agent, and it wasn't unusual for him to meet strangers looking for a new home. What could be more normal than calling his office and telling him I was moving into the neighborhood and could he show me some houses? It was stupid, I know, but for some reason, I just couldn't let it go without finding out more about him. I picked up the phone and called, and 10 minutes later I had an appointment with him for tomorrow to look at a new house. I was nervous, but I didn't know why. I met new people all the time, and not always under the most favorable circumstances. I don't know why I should be nervous after all. All I was doing was looking at a house and making small talk with a guy who was trying to convince me of its best aspects. Of course, the guy I was making small talk with was the same guy who had entertained my wife just 2 days earlier. Next chapter. I drove up and parked at the address Gerald had given me on the phone yesterday. He asked me to meet him at his house, which I thought was odd, but it had been a while since I had looked for a new home. I went to the door and rang the bell, assuming he would be waiting for me there. Instead, the door was opened by a young girl who I realized was his daughter. I was completely shocked. She looked like an attractive young woman, and from my research I knew she was 19, but she actually looked closer to 14. She had blonde hair with pigtails on each side and hairpins at her temples. She was wearing a voluminous t-shirt and a skirt that came down at least 6 inches below her knees. She was wearing gym socks and high-top tennis shoes, and while you could tell from her face that she was 14, her clothes were more appropriate for someone 12 years old. "Why can't you bastards just go away and leave me alone?" Those were the first words out of her mouth when she opened the door after I rang the bell. "Excuse me?" I asked, completely shocked by her outburst. "You, your friends, and my dad spend all your time drinking and spoiling. Why can't you just stay away? She clarified, though it was probably more clear to her than it was to me. I thought back to my research and how his red nose was indicative of too many liquid lunches. I knew he considered himself a ladies' man, and perhaps he and many of his friends led that lifestyle. I guessed that his daughter was upset by this. Perhaps the fact that he had chased her mother away had somehow affected her attitude. I'm sorry, miss, but I've never met your father. I had to meet him here so he could show me around the house, I said, hoping to calm her outburst. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I said, she said, looking down at the floor. I could tell she was embarrassed. Don't worry about it. I won't say anything. I tried to reassure her since I didn't think her father would appreciate what she said about him. Thank you. I have to go. My dad doesn't like me talking to strangers. She said this when I saw her looking towards the street. I saw a car approaching and assumed it might be her father, and as she said that she didn't want to be seen talking to me if it might upset her father. It was nice to meet you, miss, I said, just before she closed the door, and I heard it close behind her. The car stopped behind mine and he got out of it. He looked almost exactly like the picture I'd seen, although the hairline had shrunk a bit and his nose was definitely redder. I guess the picture Gloria was able to send me was from a few years ago, but he was easily recognizable now. Good morning, I'm Jerry Symington. How do you do? He began, extending his hand. Approaching me. I'm Bob. We spoke yesterday, said I, introducing myself. We shook hands, he motioned for me to get in his car, and we headed towards the house he was going to show me. So what brings you to D.C.? He asked, since I had mentioned in our conversation yesterday that I was being transferred to this city. My company is expanding, and I'll be heading up a new group. It's a promotion of sorts for me, and being here at the company headquarters has a certain symbolic significance. So what do you do? He asked, apparently talking to a lot of people, and he seemed eager to talk. I'm a forensic accountant. Our company contracts with the IRS to investigate possible fraud. There are a lot of numbers involved, and a lot of people will find it boring, but I really enjoy it, I explained. The IRS? You think you can pull some kind of string from me? He said with a chuckle. Not really. We work mostly with corporate clients, so I don't mess with individuals. The IRS doesn't have enough people to do in-depth investigations like we do, so they contract with us. But for the most part, all I see are numbers. Half the time, I don't even know who works at the companies we investigate. I was building my story. I just wanted it to sound plausible. So you said yesterday you were looking for a 4-bedroom apartment? He asked, changing the subject. Yeah, I think that's necessary. It's just me, my wife, and 2 daughters. They're old enough now that they don't like sharing a bedroom, so I think we need a room for each of them, and then we'll have an office that my wife and I can share, so I think a 4-bedroom house is almost a necessity. 2 daughters? How old are they? He asked. They're 8 and 10. Olivia is 10 and Emily is 8, and they're already starting to show independence, I explained as we continued to talk. I have a daughter of my own, but she's a little older. But I remember going through that period, and you really have to be tough to make sure they don't go down the wrong path. You have to sit on them, because it's very easy to fall under bad influences these days. He spoke as if he was an expert and was warning me of the dangers I would face raising my own children. Is it really that bad in Washington? I asked. Well, it's no worse here than anywhere else, but you just have to be very careful. You have to keep an eye on them all the time because they can go bad so easily. With my daughter, we didn't let her make friends we didn't know beforehand. Furthermore, we pulled her out of public school, and my wife homeschooled her for several years. I didn't know all this from the research, but then again, I hadn't given Gloria much time to look too deeply. Well, we have no chance of homeschooling here. My wife works as a high school principal in Denver, so she's a firm believer in the public school system. We both know it has a lot of problems, and even now she's about to take a job as a lobbyist for a company that promotes education reform. But I think it would be somewhat hypocritical of her not to let our kids attend public school. You have to do what you have to do. In our case, I think it worked, but other people may have a different experience. I think he was trying to cover himself and not annoy me, hoping he wouldn't alienate me so much that I wouldn't be interested in buying a house from him. So, your wife taught your daughter? I asked. I wondered what he had to say about her. She was good at it for a while, but we're separated now. He explained, and I didn't pursue this conversation further, even though I knew he had basically driven her to a mental breakdown. We pulled up to the house he was going to show me. It was a beautiful, spacious ranch-style house. We went inside and looked around the whole structure. It really did look very nice. I tried to make all the right noises at all the right times. I didn't really want to mess with it, but I didn't want him to think I wasn't interested in the house. My wife and I watched a video tour of the house online, and we really liked it. Seeing it in person is sometimes a little different, but I think I like it. I'm not sure I'm ready to make a commitment, and of course my wife has to see him in person. But I think he has promise. I said this as we finished looking around the house. So when do you think you and your wife can come back? He asked. Right. She should be arriving next week to sort out all the personnel issues that will be required for her new position. I think we could arrange to meet when she's in town, and the two of us could look into it. How does that sound? It sounds good to me. Let me look on my calendar and we'll see if we can work something out. I made an appointment for 11 o'clock the following Friday to stay in character, and he drove me to his house so I could pick up my car. It was an interesting morning, and I learned a lot more about him than I knew before. I still wasn't sure what my wife found in him, other than the huge tool he kept in his pants. But maybe she had a different impression than I did. Next chapter. Back at the office, I divided my time between work and thinking about what exactly Lynn saw in this guy. I got home that evening and Lynn was in the kitchen again, cooking dinner. She wasn't as obvious today as she had been earlier in the week, but I got a definite feeling. So, how was your day? She asked as I entered the kitchen, pulled up next to her, and gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, then pulled away as she worked at the stove. It's been pretty normal. Making calls, talking to people, looking for leads, the usual, I replied. How about you, honey? What did you do today? Laura and I went to see the house they were looking at the other day. I think they'll probably make an offer on it. It was a very beautiful place, and I think they will be very happy there. She lied to me. I knew from talking to Will earlier in the week that neither he nor Laura were all that interested in the house they had seen. I knew that if he and Laura had traveled anywhere together, it wasn't to see the house. I hope it was worth it, I said, looking at her for a reaction. What? Who was worth it? She said, searching for an answer that wouldn't make her look guilty. The blood rushed from her face, and even if I didn't know what she'd been up to, it wouldn't have been that hard to guess. The guy you were having fun with, I replied simply, and my words made her drop the spoon she was stirring her food with. What are you talking about? I wasn't having fun with any guy, she said, getting defensive and trying to interrupt my words. Look, Lynn, we both know you were, so let's not keep lying to each other. I wasn't with any guy. Were you following me? She didn't realize the stupidity of what she was saying. First, she tries to say she didn't do anything wrong, and then she asks me if I saw her do it. I didn't realize she was that dumb. Apparently getting caught had lowered her IQ by 30 points. I know Will didn't like the house they looked at a few days ago. There's no way in hell he's going to make an offer on it. Would you like to change your story? I said, changing the subject a bit. Okay, I was with the guy for a few minutes, she said hesitantly. I think she was still working on a story I could believe. See, it's a lot easier if you're telling the truth. She seemed to breathe a little easier. It was just a one-time thing, and it will never happen again. She said it in such a way that I could see the gears in her head kicking into action, constructing a plot. That's one, I said simply. One what? She asked, her face now completely confused. One lie. It's the first, but it won't be the last. When I was in Catholic school, the nuns told us that you should never tell just one lie. Once you've told one, you have to tell another to back up the first, and then another to cover up the second. And before you know it, You've told a dozen lies and are so confused that the whole thing falls apart. But I wasn't lying, she replied weakly. No, you lied. You said it was only once, but I know you had fun with that guy last Tuesday. Do you think I'm stupid? You were so guilty that you couldn't wait to get me into bed and try to get rid of the guilt of what you did. I talk to people all the time and I can read them like a book. You knew about this? And you didn't say anything? She asked incredulously. Of course I knew about it. And I didn't say anything because I figured it was a one-time thing. I don't know why you did it, so I figured it didn't mean anything. I'm sure I'll hear the "it was just sex" argument soon, and it didn't mean anything to me. But apparently it was important enough to you that you came back for more. It meant nothing to me. I love you, not him. I didn't think it would be long before she got to that sentence. Like I said, it meant enough to you that you couldn't keep it to one time. So is this going to be a regular occurrence from now on? I asked, not knowing what she might be thinking. My original plan to just ignore it and move on had changed considerably. No, it won't happen again. I only love you and I don't want stupidity like this to come between us. She said this, and I saw tears appear in the corners of her eyes. I wasn't sure if she was truly sorry or if she thought she had given up the life she led just for the chance to experience new things. What do you want to happen, Lynn? I asked, still not realizing how I felt about it. I want our life to be like it was before. I don't want any problems. I'm going to get over this and I want you to do the same. That's not going to be easy for me to do, honey. Apparently, I'm not enough for you. You're going to have to look for someone else. And what do you want me to do? Assume that you won't think about him while I'm making love to you? And if I make love to you at all, how do I know you didn't bring something home? Gerald didn't give me anything, she said firmly. Gerald? And how do you know that? Or did you just decide he couldn't possibly have an STD? If I were you, I'd get your ass to a clinic and get checked out. I said this hoping to scare her. I got checked after the last time and found out I was clean, but I had to sweat for a few days before that news got to me. So after I get tested and everything is fine, we can go back to normal, right? She asked, though I think there was more hope in her words. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to go back to normal, I replied simply. I'll tell you now that I don't want a divorce. Moreover, I won't give it to you even if you want it. She suddenly became defensive. Who said anything about divorce? If either of us files for divorce, I know how the laws work in this country. You think I'm going to give up half of everything I've gained just to pay you to have fun with some strange guy? That's not going to happen, honey. Then you don't mind, she repeated hopefully. No, I'm not okay with it. I said I'm not going to ask for a divorce, but that doesn't mean I'm okay with it. It's going to take a long time and a lot of humiliation on your part before we can get back to normal. So your poor little ego is bruised? She was starting to feel better and decided to hit me back. But she didn't know. My ego? How is my ego involved in this discussion? You know, you don't own me, she said, and suddenly her face took on an extremely smug look. No, I don't belong, said I, and that smug expression got even bigger. But I always thought our marriage vows gave me the exclusive right to use her. I continued, and the smug look on her face immediately disappeared. But suddenly she was at a loss for words. Obviously, either I misread our marriage vows or you didn't believe in them at all. You know, the part about renouncing everything else. Maybe you can tell me which of those two options is correct? She didn't have an answer, and I didn't think she really wanted to. That was the end of the conversation because she turned and ran off to the bedroom where she closed and locked the door behind her. I probably should have felt worse than I did, but I thought again about how deep our love for each other was. I know we had a marriage of convenience, but maybe it was too convenient. Maybe instead of a real and deep love for each other, it was just easier for us to act almost like roommates. Sure, roommates with benefits, but then again, I could have gone out and found a hooker for $2 to get the same benefits. Yeah, I know that sounds harsh, and it really was, but if I was hiring hookers, I wouldn't be so upset to find out they dumped me in favor of some guy with big equipment. Was that really all this guy had to offer my wife? I knew I'd never get a truthful answer, even if I asked the right question. And if I started talking too much, she'd realize I knew more than she thought. Right now, all she knew was that I was aware that she was having fun with another guy, and twice. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but now my initial thought of putting it all behind me and moving on with my life came to naught as soon as I got home and discovered that she had taken a second bite out of Gerald's banana. Next chapter. Things were pretty cold at home that weekend. I didn't feel the need to discuss anything with Lynn, and she felt the same way. We tried to be polite to each other around the house, but there wasn't really much to talk about, and all weekend the tension was pretty intense. I was glad to be back at work on Monday morning, even though I sometimes preferred to be at home rather than in the office. However, I had a lot on my mind this week, and sitting at home trying to figure out my future didn't get me very far. I spent half a day trying to figure out my plan. It wasn't easy, but after a while I came to what I thought was the best solution. I knew it was wrong, and that I was violating many of my moral and ethical standards, but I decided it was time to take the initiative. Yes, I know I should have taken the initiative 2 weeks ago, but again, things happened pretty quickly. The first thing I did was call Gerald and confirm our meeting for the following Friday. I told him that my wife would be in town, and the two of us would enjoy looking at the house. He seemed very enthusiastic upon hearing this and said he would be happy to show us around and answer any questions. That was the first step in my plan. The next step was financial. I was leaving town and knew I would need funds to carry out my plans. The first thing I did was talk to the CFO of our company, Jonathan Scott. John was an old friend of mine, and I knew he would likely look favorably on my plans. He was in a tight spot himself after his divorce, and once I explained the situation to him, he was able to work with me. When I first started with the company, as compensation I was given some stock options that were privately owned, which made the job a little easier. I knew that the SEC had various rules and regulations, but when Jonathan sorted out some accounting issues, it turned out that my options had expired without being exercised. This was actually not true. A clause had been added to the contract stating that the options reverted to the company if they were not exercised within a certain period of time. But the value of those options was transferred to an account I had opened in the Caymans. There was little paper trail, and I doubted that my disappearance would lead to a serious investigation of my finances. I had also cashed out my 401k retirement plan. I knew that if I stayed here, I would be hit with taxes as well as an early withdrawal penalty, but I didn't expect that to be a problem, and the entire amount was transferred back into my account in the Caymans. Most of my investment was liquidated, and the proceeds ended up in the same account, and I soon had a nice nest egg to support me for a while. The last step was to get a loan against the house and transfer the proceeds into the same account. We had about $150,000, and with an 80% interest, I was able to transfer another $120,000 to my account in the Caymans. This brought my total funds in the Caymans to almost $800,000, and I believe I will be able to live comfortably on this money for some time in the future. On Thursday, I told Lynn that I would have to go out of town the next day on an assignment and would probably be gone for a few days. This was not unusual, and although we no longer spoke, there was a slight thaw in our relationship. "You'll be back by Sunday? You know Laura and Will are coming over for the barbecue, right?" she asked me after I broke the news of my out-of-town assignment to her. "They should be. Right now I'm planning to be back around lunchtime on Sunday. I don't think anything will happen in that time that will change that." I explained to her that the barbecue was scheduled for about 4 o'clock. I packed my bag early Friday morning, putting a few days' worth of clothes in there and a few things I wanted to take with me. I wasn't going back, but Lynn didn't need to know that. As I looked around the house, I saw many things I had worked on all my life, and I felt sorry to have to leave them behind. But on the other hand, I was starting a new life, and I had the opportunity to start collecting those things again. Next chapter. I parked in front of Jerry's house a couple minutes before 11 o'clock. Just like last time, I didn't see his car there, and when I looked at the house, I thought I saw someone looking out the window, but I wasn't sure. I didn't want to scare his daughter, and I knew she had said her dad didn't like her talking to strangers, so I just waited in the car until I saw him approaching. He stopped behind me, and I got out of the car and headed for my car. "Where's your wife, Bob?" he asked, as I opened the door and got in the front seat with him. "Right. She just called and said she was running about 20 minutes late. She has an address, and she can't live without GPS, and said she'd meet us there." "Okay, let's go," he said, pulling away from the curb. "My early showing," he said with a smirk, and then winked at me as if I knew what he meant. I really did know what he meant, and all doubts about my plans suddenly vanished. We pulled up to the house and went inside. He said we could talk for a few minutes while we waited for my wife to arrive. I spent the early morning gathering the items I would need. To some, these items may seem odd, but then again, they fit my plans quite well. The first item was a stun gun that I had gotten from one of my not-so-reputable acquaintances. This particular model was very small, very powerful, and very illegal. It was manufactured in South Africa, and I was instructed to be very careful when using it. I also needed a very sharp knife. I thought one of the new ceramic knives, the kind they advertise on TV, you can cut bricks in half and slice tomatoes thin. Not available in any store. That's what the commercials usually said. I went to the As Seen on TV store at the mall and bought my own there. Both of these items were in my suit pocket along with nylon ties, latex gloves, and a Ziploc bag. I knew exactly what I planned to do and had thought it all through. As we made small talk in the living room of the house, I reached into my pocket and pressed the button for the stun gun. When Jerry went to the window to see if my wife had come in, he was suddenly on the end of it and was soon lying on the floor twitching. I later cut something off his end. There will be no details, just as a fact. I gathered up everything I had taken with me and went back outside. The door was unlocked, and in the future I would have called the medics, but right now I just wanted to leave. I'm sure there would be no doubt left as to who had done this to him, but by then I would be long gone. I was sure that while the police might issue a warrant for my arrest, I doubted there would be a nationwide manhunt for the man who had done the man justice. 10 minutes later, the cab dropped me off in front of Jerry's house, where my own car was waiting at the curb. I was just about ready to get in my car to drive away when I saw the front door open, and out stepped Jerry's daughter Angelica. Her clothes were similar to what she had been wearing that day. "You're leaving already, aren't you?" she asked as she approached me. "Yes, I've looked at the house and I'm going home," I replied, thinking she was talking about me leaving. "No, you're leaving. You're not coming back." I was surprised at her words. She seemed to know that I was leaving town and that, yes, I wasn't coming back. "Yes, you're right. I'm leaving," I said. I didn't see the point in lying to her. "Take me with you," she asked, though there was more of an imperative in her words. I was about to tell her I couldn't, when I suddenly wondered how she would be able to take care of herself. Of course, her father would be incapacitated for a while, and I didn't know if she was capable of taking care of herself or not. What could happen to her? I knew from the research I had done that her mother was not capable of taking care of her, and her mother's parents already had a hard enough time taking care of their own daughter, and another person would probably be an overhead for them. Angie also told me later that she was very disappointed in her mother for not fighting to get her away from Jerry. I had no thoughts about her father's parents, even though I knew nothing about them. That was another part of my plan I hadn't considered. "Okay, take whatever you need," I said, though I wasn't sure I should have. She ran off into the house and came out of there 2 minutes later with a small purse and nothing else. "That's all you took?" I asked incredulously. "I don't need anything else." That was all she said. Then she got in the car with me and we drove off. "Don't you want to know where we're going?" I asked, more to say something than really meaning it. I knew where I was going, but the fact that I was taking someone with me was never part of my plans. In fact, I had no idea what I was going to do with this girl. She was in the car with me now, and we were heading to the airport. "I'm leaving this house and coming with you. That's all I need to know." She didn't seem sad or just a little curious. It seemed strange to me, but I didn't know anything about her at the time. Before heading to the airport, I had one more stop to make. I went into a FedEx store and asked the clerk for a small box. I wrote a short note to Will beforehand and folded it and put it in the bag along with a DVD of Lynn and her sister at the coffee shop. Will, ask yourself why these two are so upset. Don't limit yourself to the obvious. Also ask yourself why they seem so familiar with the subject. I sealed and inscribed the address on the box, then asked the salesperson to set it aside for delivery on Sunday afternoon, when Laura and Will would be at the house with Lynn for a barbecue. She assured me that the box would be delivered as instructed. We drove to the airport and I parked in the long-term parking lot before we took the shuttle to the terminal. I asked for directions and found my way to a small hangar where private planes were parked. We boarded an airplane that was chartered by a newspaper, more specifically the CEO, Ed Murrow. He and his wife were going on vacation to Florida, and I asked for a ride. Angelica's presence with me caused a few raised eyebrows, but no one said anything. Ed and I had become good friends when he hired me at the newspaper 15 years ago, and while he had no personal experience with divorce, his son had taken the fall after his son's wife was caught cheating. He was well aware of how badly a husband is treated in such cases and did not hesitate to help with my plans, although I did not fill him in on any of the details. Ned! During the flight, I made small talk with him and his wife, but Angelique said nothing. She sat wide-eyed and gazed curiously out the window and at everything inside the airplane. I had no doubt that she had never flown, but that fact didn't seem to bother her as the plane continued its journey south. Once the plane landed in Miami, everyone got off the plane and a limo pulled up to Ed and his wife. There was enough room in it for Angelica and me, even with my one suitcase and Angelica's purse. We drove to the dock and then boarded a large luxury charter fishing boat. Ed and his wife were going fishing. They both loved being on the ocean and hunting for trophy swordfish and marlin. I quickly called the DC police and reported the home invasion where Gerald was presumably still there, tied to the stair railing. They would find him and get him medical attention. I dropped my phone as we were out of cell phone range. Angelica and I shared a cabin, very nicely furnished and very comfortable. We spent almost the entire trip in it, which took 2 days, but soon the ship docked in Grand Cayman. This was my final destination, and apparently Angelica's. I still didn't know what I was going to do with her, but the thought of just leaving her somewhere wasn't even considered. Next chapter. I bought a small house on the island where I was going to spend my time. I had originally planned to just lay around and relax, but I had never led a sedentary lifestyle. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew I had to find something to do. Now I had more important things to do. When I bought the house, it had a few basic furnishings, but when we moved in, I realized we would have to buy a few more things to make it livable. I still wasn't sure about Angelica, but since the house had 2 bedrooms, one would be hers and the other would be mine. We spent the first week in the house buying the necessary furniture and picking out her clothes. Of course, the clothes she was wearing when we arrived were totally unsuitable for island living, so a visit to the clothing store was necessary. She picked out a few t-shirts, shorts, and a pair of sandals, but felt uncomfortable asking me to buy her anything. I can't let you buy me things. I don't have anything to pay for them. She embarrassedly told me to pick out whatever she saw fit. Since I knew next to nothing about what young women could wear, I left all decisions in her hands. Nevertheless, after a few days she became more comfortable, and we began to get to know each other better. There was plenty to do on the island, but playing tourist was not on my list of things to do at the moment. We spent time talking and exploring our neighborhood a bit, which included other houses, and we met and talked to a few people, though none of them we were able to be friends with long enough. We went into town and sometimes ate at a small cafe, but more often we bought food from the market and brought it back to the house, where I discovered Angelica was a very good cook. We ate lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and seafood, although living on a tropical island, this was to be expected. Epilogue. What happened to get us here? Jerry came out of the hospital after a 2-week stay. He was broken. He felt like anyone who saw him would immediately realize he wasn't that kind of man. At first, he tried to reconcile with his ex-wife, but she had already been in therapy for 3 years and was much stronger. When he suggested she get back together, she told him to back off. I thought it was funny, not only because of the impossibility of doing what she said, but because he couldn't do it now, even if it were physically possible. He went to his house and rarely came out of there, depressed and embittered. Lynn now lived with her sister Laura in a cheap apartment. The first time after I left, she found that she couldn't make her mortgage payments as well as her home equity loan. I know I'm a bastard, but in my opinion, she deserved it. She didn't have a paying job, but soon had to find one. But even then, her professional skills were outdated, and finding something that paid enough to cover her expenses was impossible. Senator Smith wasn't having an affair. It turned out that his wife had an affair with a married man and ended up pregnant. As was customary at the time, she left to visit relatives and returned about 8 months later. In the meantime, her mother gave the young woman a new sister. Nate offered to shelter the girl, but by then, her life had already taken shape, and she only knew that Elizabeth was her older sister. Soon the girl fell into bad company and became addicted to some recreational drugs. Nate and his wife found her and put her in a hotel to give her a chance to dry out. Doctors, nurses, and various therapists visited her to keep her confidential. They were looking for a quiet rehab facility in rural Nebraska. The rumors were never in the public domain, but one jerk reporter asked him about it on camera. "If you think I'm having an affair and you can prove it, knock yourself out." He turned and walked away, and that was the end of the story. I was sitting on a beach blanket when Angie finished swimming in the ocean. I couldn't join her as I was looking after our 3-year-old Olivia and her 15-month-old sister Emily. Yes, that was the name of my imaginary children when I was creating the background for Jerry. I didn't give Angie all the details, but when I suggested each name, she liked the choices. Her belly was starting to swell again. She didn't feel it necessary to have an ultrasound to know it was going to be another girl. We told the girls about the imminent arrival of a new sister, and each of them was thrilled. As excited as is even possible for a 3-year-old and a 15-month-old girl. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.